Michael Shires, he's led in university management and governance for many years and is fresh off of playing a key role in the founding of a new free speech, free inquiry university in the United States, the University of Austin, which tries to exemplify many of the ideals we've been talking about today. And now, as I mentioned, he's playing a key role in helping the Trump administration from his post at the recently founded America First Policy Institute in reforming higher ed. So, love it, some of it, none of it, all of it. A lot going on right there that he's involved in that is really shaping higher ed. South of the border, and I think it's going to have impacts around the world, and is really a kind of a case study in point of this question that's running through the course of the day. To what extent do we reform universities, and how do we do it? So evidently, Michael's career in education, that's been over 23 years, it's led him to a point where he thinks evidently that the external pressure and government legislation is needed to significantly reform universities. So I think a really great opportunity to hear from him on what's led him to where he is today, and then to ask a lot of questions for sure. So without further ado, please welcome Michael Shires.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your hospitality and allowing me to... Oh, what's up? Oh, this? Here we go. My necklace. Thanks for your hospitality and allowing me to come up here and share some, at least of my experiences. I'm not sure I have great answers for anything. There's been a lot of conversation this morning about whether you need to do it from without or within, and the answer is yes. We need everything. If you look at the problems we're facing, I started my career in higher ed, and there was an observation this morning about we don't study it very much. I was one of the few scholars looking at higher ed questions back in the 90s when I started my doctorate at the Rand Graduate School in Santa Monica. And today, there are still very few people looking at the ins and outs of higher ed as a business model, as a part of the economy, as a contributor to the economy. I mean, every university does their economic impact study where they justify why the legislature should give them more money. But the real question of what is our impact on the economy and the people around us and the lives and the communities we have a lot of anecdotes and not a lot of analysis. And so I've kind of spent a big part of my career being that person looking outside in the institutions. I was in startups. I was at RAND, and then I went to the Public Policy Institute of California, which was a brand new think tank on California policy in the Bay Area. Then I was at Pepperdine for 25 years. When I was I think I was the fourth professor hired at School of Public Policy there, building that and going through 4 cycles of accreditation with WASC. For some reason, I have this penchant for leadership and management, so I got to do the accreditation. No good deed goes unpunished in the academy. And from there, I went to the University of Austin. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk a lot about that experience in just a second. Pepperdine was a unique place, and it was a foundation that kind of built my academic career. I'd spent a lot of time in think tanks after RAND and PPIC. I'd been in the private sector before that, working in startups, actually, back before you got rich doing startups. I didn't learn about that till later in life. Back in the 80s, you didn't get rich in startups. The guy who thought of it got rich, and you did all the work. Kind of like academic departments today. Those who do the work rarely get enriched by the investment. My time at Pepperdine, though, was phenomenal from the perspective that Pepperdine really was on the front line of a culture war that was unfolding in the United States at the time. What attracted me to Pepperdine was, and we actually were written up in the public policy journals on this, they didn't just start with the idea of what should government do to solve a problem? They asked the question, what problem should we be solving? What are the challenges we're facing? What are we trying to achieve? And all of the work that I've done since then has been about problem solving. And if you think of the political process as the process that brings in diverse perspectives as you're trying to solve these problems, Public policy should be a tool to inform that and to guide it. And it should incorporate those values questions up front. And that was really Pepperdine's big, unique contribution to the field of public policy back in the early 2000s. Because of that, we had a very deep appreciation for viewpoint diversity, for this idea that the university is not just an ivory tower. Actually, we came to appreciate the ivory tower. If you think about it, the Wuhan lab, places like it, were supposed to be places where we took these really horrible diseases and figured out what to do about them in the future, right? And we built all these protections around them to prevent the rest of the world from being infected by them. And in some ways, that's what universities are. We take all of our ideas, we collect evidence, we mix them all together, and we try and find the good ones and share those with the rest of the world. Well, something happened over the last 40 years where the ivory tower became the ivory temple, where in fact, universities sometimes got internally infected by some of these ideas. And then in the last 20 years, they've been the source of the infection for the rest of society. And we've actually done COVID on a social basis. And so our work at Pepperdine really focused on this viewpoint diversity question, and we came to appreciate one simple fact. There's lots of meetings like this going on in the United States and around the world. One of the things in our experience at the University of Austin, this is a global phenomenon. Some of the richest conversations we had were with folks in Eastern Europe and Australia, talking about what they can do to deal with the challenges they're facing, just as we're having, as the Instant MLI has been focused on this for this last year. These conversations have been going on for decades. I still remember in 1995, I had just gone to PPIC. Linda Waite, who was the president of the Population Association of America, the Demographers Conference, gave a speech, her presidential address in San Francisco, right down the street from my office. One of my colleagues was there, where she talked about how a two-parent family and marriage is good for society. And she cited all these statistics about how if your child grows up in a two-parent household, this is transformational for their future. She was castigated. If she didn't have tenure at Chicago, she likely wouldn't have received it. She was marginalized in her profession. She ended up writing a book about it, which didn't help the situation much. But these challenges of how you deal with ideas and how you deal with kind of the policing of ideas by organizations and associations and the academy itself are not new. That was 30 years ago that was a flashpoint. Today, it happens on a daily basis. Talk about grants, you talk about all kinds of other, you talk about promotion, you talk about hiring, you talk about paths, you talk about career choices. Why in the world, if you're a young, say, white, male, cisgendered graduate student, would you pick the academy over doing engineering, where you at least have a career path because A, you're going to be able to get a government clearance in the US if you're that, this is my son's path. You're going to be able to get a government clearance and you're going to be able to go off and do work for the rest of your life. And so the academy has lost some of its best and brightest because of this. There's probably some sociological implications, but I only have 20 minutes, so I'm not going to be too academic. I want to talk about the experience going from Pepperdine to the University of Austin. So I was kind of approached with this idea. You guys believe in viewpoint diversity. How would you build a university that models it? And the decision to build a university instead of fixing another one was actually pretty simple. It's really hard to undo the ingrained processes inside of institutions. Once a faculty senate exists, only very recently, in fact, Texas just signed a law allowing them to dissolve faculty senates. You can imagine it's not well received in the academy. The implications of academic freedom still have to be figured out. But the question was, how do you create an institution that fosters viewpoint diversity while at the same time preserving academic freedom and not getting stuck in all these faculty governance kind of questions? And so I was given the challenge, hey, how would we do this? And so I left California, where I'd spent most of my career, and moved to Texas. I moved to another country. This is kind of north of the border. Texas is kind of south of the border. It is another world and another place. But we sat down and we took this issue on directly. And the goal was to create a prototype. It was not to be instantly a 10,000 student university. The state of Texas wouldn't let us. Anybody who tells you that Texas is the land of freedom and innovation has never gone through the regulatory process in Texas. It was basically accreditation. And I know Canada handles this a little different, but it was comparable to the national accreditations in the United States. Everybody assumed it would take us 2 to 3 years just to get through Texas. We managed to get through Texas and Middle States, the first stage of it, in less than 3 years. We went from concept to students in 34 months, which was just unheard of. There were folks who told us we needed $4 billion to do it. I think we ended up spending somewhere around $60 million to do it. It's expensive. It is not cheap. Building the regulatory capital, we had to put up bonds equivalent to the entire tuition, which we didn't charge. We set tuition at $30,000. We raised money to fund scholarships for every student so they wouldn't have to pay tuition in the first cohort. And the state of Texas still made us put aside money equivalent to as if they'd written checks so they would get a check if the institution failed. I mean, the regulatory hurdles in starting a new institution. But to the topic at hand, how do you create academic freedom in a university? That was our big challenge. We weren't going to have tenure. We had 5-year contracts for our faculty, so at least our founding faculty, so they'd be confident they had a job. And we set very specific conditions for how they'd be separated. And then we created an appellate process where any member of the university community, student, staff, or faculty, if they felt they were being fired for ideological reasons, could appeal to an outside body. And we created what we call the adjudicative panel. And Neil Ferguson was the author of this, and he said the word was hard to say for the simple reason that we never wanted to use it. But the reality was we got folks like Robbie George to sit on this panel and to adjudicate instances where there would be a dispute over whether the termination was for other reasons or whether it was for ideological statements or things that would violate academic freedom. And so this process was put into place, again, not just for faculty, but also for students and staff who felt like they'd been wronged. I mean, this is probably our biggest innovation. We created a constitution which assigned a bunch of functions, but it was things like the president's in charge, the board's in charge of the president, right? I mean, they're basic things that every university has. I think the other thing that we did that was special was we sent a message. We set a tone that the culture of our institution was about open discourse and debate. And as an administrator in this environment, I was the chief of staff. Getting things done in an environment where you say, yes, our culture is all about debate, required a tremendous amount of mission alignment. And so we put together a team of folks who believed in what we were doing. Now you might ask yourself, how did all this work? In some cases, I think it worked too well. We had, like I said, it took a lot longer to do some of the things, but still much faster than your typical academic department or university. I was in leadership at Pepperdine. I can attest to the fact that even as a medium-sized liberal arts college, there's a lot of bureaucratic process. But I think the most interesting thing that came about as a result of this mission alignment were the kind of students and faculty we attracted. Somebody was talking earlier about how do you change institutions from within. I take great hope in the fact that when we announced the University of Austin over the course of those 2 years before we hired our first group of faculty, we had over 6,000 inquiries from PhD level folks who were interested in what we were doing at the University of Austin. I mean, think about that. There were 6,000 people interested in moving to Austin, which if you've ever spent summers in Austin is not a minor thing. Move to Austin and teach in this environment. When we actually hired 20 faculty slots, or 15 faculty slots, we had over 800 applicants. And these weren't the mass mailed, like I've done econ searches. They take the job openings for economists and send a resume to everybody on it. These were thoughtful letters. We had over 800 applicants for 15 slots. Now tells you that within universities across this country, there is deep interest and passion in this issue. So how have we gotten where we are today? A big part of how we've gotten where we are today is, how do I say this nicely? In some ways, the crazies have taken over. I don't mean this, that's not a derogatory statement other than to say that in 1981, when I was at UCLA at the height of the Cold War, I thought for a week about being a political science major. And that week ended when I went to the US-Soviet political science class. The professor stood up and extolled the virtues of Mother Russia for an hour and a half. I kind of decided that just didn't align with the papers I wanted to write, and I probably should look somewhere else. And I switched to econ, which I'm not sure was a huge upgrade. But the reality is that the idea of dissent and ideology on campus has always been around, and it's supposed to be there. It is a powerful thing. It is how we do our jobs. My ideas don't get better when I talk to somebody who agrees with every one of them. They get better when I talk to someone who has different insights or different perspectives, who can challenge them, right? And that's the idea of the university model. So what happened over time, though, was that the postmodernist perspective has dominated the environment. We actually took theology out of the classrooms, even on campuses like Pepperdine that have religion classes, right? We marginalized a little more. Now, Pepperdine has done, in full testimony, Pepperdine has done a great job of balancing this over time. But in many institutions, that wasn't the case. Even in faith-based institutions, postmodernism became the religion of the institution, which is to say there is no truth we're pursuing. How dare you say there's a truth, right? This goes back to that metaphysical foundation, right? How dare you say there's a truth to pursue? And so we ended up in an environment where the institutions didn't know what to do with this. And as all of you know, faculty want to do their work. They don't want to be involved in governance. They don't want to be involved in these debates, especially when it risks their career. And so they would just let the administrators have the debates. And this is where I'm talking about the crazies. The administrators were happy to silence the debate by agreeing to whatever the other side demanded. So whoever stood up and said, this is what we demand, they got it. And that's where institutions started evolving in this space. At the same time, and this was mentioned earlier today, you had the professional associations driving this effort from the outside. My own field in public administration, the National Association of Public Administration Schools actually has a DEI-JA strategic plan for the association, and they run the accreditor for public policy. So guess what the criteria are when you go up for accreditation in that framework? The ABA, the AMA, the APA, all these professional associations are feeding this process from the outside. So even in the Canadian context, to the extent that you have disciplinary accreditation, you have this problem. Now in the US, we layered on top of that the regional accreditors, who also had the same processes involving. And so here's the good news. All we have to do is start saying other things on campus, and some of that stuff will disappear. Now, President Trump, and there are lots of reasons that people love or don't love President Trump, has put all of this on the table. And right now, there are ongoing conversations, whether it's about grants that were talked about earlier, whether it's accreditation, whether it's civil rights, whether it's anti-Semitism. He has put all of these things in play and actually brought a focused spotlight on the academy. Now is the time for people on these campuses, and they are doing it in pockets and in places, to speak up and say, what are the processes that we need to follow? The University of Austin, just to give you an update, we launched with 92 students last fall. I think they have another 70 this fall. These aren't your normal students. These are risk takers, because UATX is not yet fully accredited. These are risk takers. We selected for students who took initiative, who didn't complain about the world, who didn't write an essay on how they were victims, but it said, this is what I did when I saw a problem. And so we have classrooms. If you think about your class like your top 5 students, out of the 92 students in the first cohort, we probably had 70 of those sitting at the table. Now, when you take a group of students like that and you go out and find a group of faculty who are just committed to teaching and growing the individual student, you get this dynamic that just feeds off itself. And it was kind of funny because the faculty always came in with the standard questions, what's my release time going to be? It's like, well, you tell me once you've had 3 classes. The students absolutely devoured this. The faculty loved it. It's helped their scholarship because they have amazing students that challenge their ideas and help them to think. The students have grown tremendously. We are now set for the next year. We got some media attention through all this. We were dubbed the anti-woke university. I hated that every time it happened, but we decided to let it happen because it was a cool tagline that got us more students and more donors. Remember, we were privately funded. There was no government funding in this entire process. The university has raised, when I left 6 months ago, about $200 million so far. I always thought we were the a-woke university without wokeness, as opposed to the anti-woke, because in fact, and somebody mentioned this morning, you know, there's insight to come from every perspective, including the victim and oppressed oppressor models. And we need to learn from that and figure out how to craft solutions together. So that's UATX. I was there for 3 years. I was a public policy guy. As chief of staff, I couldn't do any public policy work because the university was neutral. So I couldn't go on TV and say, this is a good idea or a bad idea because I was speaking for the office of the president. So I told my boss 2 years into it, this was my last year. Timing worked out. President Trump won the election. So a lot of think tanks in DC emptied out to go into the administration, and I was fortunate to step into one of those roles. The America First Policy Institute is one of the leading institutes in shaping policy, I would say, this week in the United States. I think for the next 4 years, we have a tremendous influence. It was actually founded by people from the Trump 1 cabinet and agencies. We've placed a ton of people in the administration. So the questions that are on the table, the work we're doing in higher ed, we get to help shape all these outcomes. Somebody asked me, well, why would you go into such a chaotic environment? It's exactly because it's a chaotic environment that the opportunity exists to reassemble what's going forward. Just to give you guys a sense of the issues that are on the table, I mean, you've seen or heard probably of most of the executive orders. Professional accreditors and associations are under the scope. Grants are under the scope. Obviously, anti-Semitism has been the front edge of this. We're actually looking at redefining the post-secondary education space with higher ed as a sub-part of it, which is probably the one that terrifies the universities the most because it means they might get competition for federal dollars in the US, which is a big deal. We are looking at, as you graduate from high school, you have a range of opportunities. I will say the Europeans and the Canadians, the Australians, all do this better than we do. We don't have an environment where there's vocational opportunities. I mean, if you're a college in the US, it just means you don't have a PhD. It doesn't have a different kind of meaning than it does in other places. And so we haven't done well with the kind of professionalization of trades and vocational programs. And yet we have an economy that's reinventing itself. It used to be coding was the cool thing and computer science was the hot degree. AI might have blown that up a little bit. But there are all these new technologies. AI is now the cool, sexy thing. I'm sure in 2 years, it will be something entirely different. And we'll all be sitting there going, how do I teach in a class? I mean, there was a joke, a meme I saw somewhere about, the student using AI to write a paper that the professor had AI grade. And somehow the AI always got an A, and I mean, that's the world that a lot of faculty are facing right now in a lot of institutions. And it requires you to change your teaching methods. It requires a much more personal kind of education than mass-produced public institutions don't do well at, right? I mean, I dealt with it 1 year in my policy class because I was a little frustrated about papers and turn it in. It sent me some signals saying students were doing bad stuff. So I just said, fine, after I grade your paper, I'm going to select at random, and you don't know who it is, each of you to do a 10-minute presentation on the findings of your paper. And by the way, it's happening in a half hour. And Yeah, it was a great way to find out if they knew what was in their paper. Oral exams are another way to deal with that. I got to do that during COVID because I had kind of unlimited bandwidth because I couldn't go do anything else. So we're looking at all of those issues, but the real vision is to create market pressures. Somebody was talking about pressures from without and within, to create competition in markets, to create opportunity, to create new institutions. UATX shouldn't cost $60 million to launch. It should cost $5 or $10 million to launch. We need to create environments where employer groups can form vocational academies to teach students. They're already doing it. They just don't collaborate, and the students don't get any credit for it. But you got trained. It used to be like the certified net engineer at Microsoft, right? You got trained separately, and I mean, even law firms deal with this, right? I mean, ask any law firm partner, and they'll tell you the first 2 years of an associate's career is training them how to actually be a lawyer after they went to law school, right? We have this across the board. So, allowing competition. The challenge with creating competition is there's going to be failures. And so you have to build into it mechanisms for mitigating that risk to not only the government, but especially to the students, right? And so creating mechanisms for transparency, accountability. The really big issue, and this is one I take deeply to heart, is reforming the accreditation process and the reporting processes so that the costs aren't there. When we were launching the University of Austin, to accept federal money, we were going to have to hire 5 people. Before we got permission to accept federal money, we're going to have to pay them for like 6 months to sit around and do nothing, because one of the requirements was you have the demonstrated capacity to file all the paperwork you will have to file, and it would take 5 people to fill out the paperwork. And we're talking 500 students here. We're not talking 50,000. And so eliminating those cost burdens is a big part of how you reform higher ed. I've gotten in trouble for this, but I like to point out that most universities have become the places that professors get to have the lives to which they become accustomed. But there's an element of truth in that. I had a colleague at UC Santa Barbara who told me one time, if the California taxpayer knew what I got to do for a living, they would never let me do it. He was teaching 1 graduate class a year with 4 doctoral students, and then doing whatever research he wanted. And he was making, in the 80s, something like $300K to do that. So a lot of this is about transparency and about equalizing those forces. I will tell you right now, at the end of the day, there will always be the elite universities. They're going to look the way kind of they look today. The disciplines are safe and intact in those spaces. The chaos is going to be around the edges. It's going to be the small liberal arts colleges and the state schools who have to realign and figure out what their product is they're selling. As you can imagine, our work is not favorable to College for All as a solution. We think that there are many honorable ways to engage with the economy. I'm always envious of the French and what is it now, a 30-day work week or 30-hour work week, something like that. Somewhere around hour 80 or 90 of the week. I kind of feel that way. So, I mean, that's just a quick survey. I think the future of this is really, and especially for Canada, I mean, I'm excited to hear about Alberta kind of pushing the boundaries on some things. But as this becomes an issue, and it will become an issue, the cost of higher education, $44 billion is a big number. And I know there's not a large private sector, but if you try and go to the US, there is. The cost of education makes it real for every household. It's probably the second most important decision families make together. After deciding to be a family, it's usually a home, buying a house, and then education for their kids, right? And so this is a central issue. It can become a political issue. As it does, the opportunity becomes for people to step forward and lead. President Trump is highly disruptive. I'm not sure this is a form of leadership I recommend for any paradigm, other than to say literally everything is on the table, every single thing. And what that means is we can change literally everything. So that's the excitement for me. I think in terms of the conversation that we're having here, one of the things we all have to partner on are the professional associations, each of us inside of our disciplines. And I think I'll leave it with that. I'm sure there's questions. I was really quick in my descriptions of the University of Austin and AFPI. I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have. I've intimidated everybody. No.
Can you tell us who the major funders were for establishing the University of Austin?
Sure.
I'm wondering if they're the Koch brothers and those kinds of people or something else.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because when we launched the university, everybody said, oh, this is a right-wing university. Our money actually came from both sides. If you think about it, the idea of free speech is not a right-wing value. I mean, it is a right-wing value, but it's not exclusively right-wing. The free speech movement of the 60s was a child of the left. Even by today's standards, it was a child of the left. And so interestingly enough, our funding tended to come from the ends of the spectrum, but it also came from a lot of business owners who wanted to leave a legacy. If you think about, obviously, so our original founders were Joe Lonsdale, Barry Weiss from New York Times, Neil Ferguson, Heather Hying, and Pano Canellis, the president. And so they were the founding visionaries behind the university. Joe Lonsdale being at the table, we had access to lots of tech money. As you've seen in the tech world, they're all over the place politically, and it actually depends on which month you talk to them, which side of the aisle they're on. So our money, a lot of our money came from there. We have an endowed chair that's donated by a very strong left, very left of center person. I don't think it's public who she is, but a Jewish woman from New York City who was part of the free speech movement, who put up $5 million to endow a chair for a professor. So we've had support across the political spectrum. In the tech environment, there was a lot of interest just in, so one of the things I didn't explain about the curriculum at UATX was it combined the classical with the practical, something that was kind of a theme in this morning's conversations, but it was really about using Plato and Aristotle and asking questions about the world we're in today, so chaos and civilization, what's the role of technology in the context of those great thinkers. And then layered on top of that was a requirement that they do a major project that required them to do project management skills, submit proposals, do elevator speeches, do a final public presentation, solicit a mentor. I mean, one of the skills kids today don't have, and my kids are not immune to this, is actually picking up the phone and making a phone call. They will text or email anybody on the planet, but ask them to dial a number and talk to a human, and it terrifies them. So the idea of this project was to give them those practical skills and experiences so that they're ready for the workforce. I mean, one of the biggest disservices we've done to the next generation is to tell them you don't need to have a job when you apply to college, because we want you to volunteer. We want you to get, if you want to get into the elite schools, you do volunteer work, you take AP classes, you spend all your time on that. And getting a job is looked down on. Whereas, like most of the professional workforce skills I learned, like my boss is always right, until he's not my boss anymore. The customer is usually right. You work hard even if it wasn't your fault. All those kinds of questions and that personal responsibility all came out of working at Taco Bell. It didn't come out of any of my classes.
Thank you, and thanks so much for this talk. I think the University of Austin it's a really inspiring project for those of us here in Canada who think that we need institution building as a solution. So one of the big questions that I have, like you mentioned that the cohort of students you have, they're risk takers because you're not a fully accredited school yet, or the school is not fully accredited yet, they are willing to sort of take that risk. But how do you grapple with that issue, generally speaking? Because to me, I see that as you mentioned, there's a huge investment for families, for students. It's also a big investment for donors. And I'm sure there's, those outside of the bounds, free speech motivated donors who will contribute. But a lot of them want to contribute to the institutions that are going to, produce doctors and lawyers and have that kind of gravitas. So how do you grapple with that issue generally for all those different stakeholders?
So, interestingly enough, raising money for the students was one of the easiest things that we did. And this was my experience at Pepperdine. If you're talking about especially somebody who's late in their life, telling them that they're going to invest in a person in the next generation and making that personal and real. You've seen the commercials on TV. We'll send you your portfolio about the child or the animal you adopt. We had tremendous success attracting, and we didn't just give them free scholarships for 1 year, we gave them all 4 years free. That was part of how we mitigated the risk for the families. All they had to pay for was housing. And they had really nice housing, I will say. I wanted to move in. So we mitigated some of the risk on the risk-taking side. The backside was we didn't want to mitigate all the risk. I mean, this is part of that mental resiliency, and we invested heavily in mental health when we launched this program. We had professionals available for students to talk to, for faculty to talk to. We didn't make it a theme of the organization. It was just part of the infrastructure. I mean, I think there's something about crafting an environment. And I had the same experience that was talked about this morning. My last semester teaching at Pepperdine, 1/4 of my students fully had special accommodations. And we were coming off of COVID, so there was a lot of intensity in that area to begin with. But that is a trend in student populations. But in the case of the university, we were worried about the safety of the students. We knew the parents personally. I mean, we're recruiting these kids and everybody's involved. So it was a real family relationship, I would say, in some ways. On the donor side, we involved the donors in those relationships. We would have events where we would bring students in. And it was funny because fundraising, when you brought the students in, was easy. The donors were just so impressed by there is so much potential in the student populations out there if they're allowed to express it. The problem is so many of our institutions stifle it and suppress it or just divert it into useless activities. But there is a lot of raw energy and intellect in the student population. And that's part of what we're trying to do at AFPI right now is just how do we create opportunities for that new institution to emerge time and again. I think in a place like Canada, obviously you're going to have a lot of benefactors. You have to get a charter, which is its own. But I will tell you this. People told me how hard Texas was going to be. It's almost always doable. It's just you have to work really hard, and you have to check their boxes, not yours. And so sometimes that means telling the story, and we've all done this, I'm sure, with accreditors and regulators, where you tell your story in their language so that they'll check the box.
Oh, thank you. My question is not about Austin, but about your AFPI perch. Understand that you're at AFPI and not in the administration. Can you help us understand what the administration is trying to do at the higher end universities? Like, there's something going on with Harvard and Columbia and so forth. Are they trying to destroy those institutions or reform them, or how is Harvard going to be different at the end of this process than it was at the beginning of this process?
Okay, well, as you pointed out, I can't speak for the administration or the president or the secretary. I can say that the U.S. political climate, affirmative action was the platform, and the distinctions that were raised earlier about the grants. Affirmative action was the platform that DEI got imposed on universities. Everybody took that. We want you to have a diverse faculty, which has been the law of the United States since 1965. Right? And translated it into, we now want you to adopt this ideology in pursuit of that goal. And all they did was take what the goals were and rewrite them in that language. And so when the Students for Fair Admissions lawsuit was decided by the Supreme Court, which functionally invalidated affirmative action, at least in college admissions, the Biden administration ignored it and in fact doubled down on the alternative. Now, it's not fully the Biden administration's fault. Californians passed Prop 209, which did the exact same thing in 1996. And as you will see in the headlines, UCLA is one of the poster children for the current confrontation with the Trump administration. The Trump administration is trying to undo the last 20 years of manipulation of what was a program for 50 years. And it's a bit of a culture shock. But the goal really is to pursue the American ideal that everybody should be treated the same. And so that is the goal. I'm not sure The question to me isn't whether that will happen in the next couple years. Will Harvard change tomorrow? Maybe not. Will other institutions ask the question, how do we make sure all of our students get treated equally? I think so. And so I think the idea is that these institutions, I mean, Harvard chose to put up a fight on this issue and to litigate it. They've become kind of the poster child for the opposition in this area. I think eventually everybody will sit down and agree that, yeah, we should treat all of our students the same. This goes to the conversation about boys earlier, right? That all of our students should have the same opportunity, the same programs. It's going to be a little messy until that happens. I mean, one of the projects that I'm working on are what are the implications to the various kinds of settlements or rulings that could come out of this lawsuit. You know, if you're a public university in Iowa, what does this mean to you? And so I think the courts still in the US have some work to do in sort of deciding whether DEI language is constitutional or not, right? Affirmative action in the case of admissions, a narrow case, has been decided. The Trump Justice Department has said that extends pretty much to all affirmative action. Those things will all have to be litigated and resolved. That will decide the long-term direction of those things in the US. I mean, once that second or third ruling comes out on those issues, I'd say we're about a year and a half from it, so it's going to be chaotic until then. But I do think the court will have to rule on it at some point. But I don't think there's any intent to destroy any institutions. It really is to make the stakes real. I mean, one of the things that's missing from this whole equation is the US government invests, I mean, you were talking about $44 billion in Canada, and that probably includes a lot of provincial money. The federal government in the US invests well over $200, $300, $400 billion in higher education, depending on how you want to measure it. And that's a huge chunk of public interest if you think about what the federal government wants in exchange for that. There are some institutions like Hillsdale that have said, we want no part of federal strings, so we're not going to do it. The administration right now is just basically sending a clear message that there is a public interest, there are strings attached to this money, and we want to make sure that that interest is being served. It's going to be messy for another 18 months is my guess. But that is something that actually I get to work on.
Hello. We were talking a little bit at lunch about the small liberal arts colleges. You mentioned it again in your talk that they seem to be dying. Could you explain why you think that's happening, given that there seems to be significant interest in the new university, which in a way seems to represent a kind of education, at least the one that I benefited from at the University of Dallas, which is a small liberal arts college in Texas. So what's happening? Why are they dying?
Well, so this is actually, in some ways, the consequence of the sector not thinking about itself as an enterprise or a business. I mean, there is a market for certain kinds of goods and services out there, and every institution has gotten along really well when there's lots of students and not many seats. And especially these small liberal arts colleges, and when, and this is the backside of it, there's unlimited federal money available to subsidize these operations. I mean, the US outstanding student loan debt right now is about $1.7 trillion. I mean, that's a big number. Even, you know, you don't need very many of those to be a lot of money. What that means is that the taxpayers of the United States are on the hook for the value of that degree as exhibited by every person that goes in the marketplace. And so parents have been I mean, if you think about tuition, it's a tax on the middle class for the most part. Poor students pay almost no tuition. Wealthy students, it's not a big part of their income, but it's this kind of progressive tax on the middle class. And middle class households have had to foot the bill for this. And you know, the folks who pay back their loans are usually middle class households, right? And so at the end of the day, the parents are now looking at this going, I can't afford this anymore. I can't afford to make this investment. One of the things that the administration and Congress did in this last iteration was to send a message that there's not unlimited federal money anymore, that we're now going to cap these loans, and we eliminated one entire category of loans that was essentially a subsidy for graduate programs at universities, where the university would set whatever price they wanted, and students could borrow up to that price for free from the federal government without any kind of limitations or qualifications. And so there's been some changes to do that. That's going to have an implication on institutions that were dependent on that money. But it's also going to make the real cost of education apparent and evident. One of the things that universities have done, and I hate this, my kids went to college, they started in 2014 and 2016. I hated going on the college tours because everybody wasn't telling me how good their engineering department was. They were telling me, we've got a lazy river. We've got a climbing wall. Look at the views our students have in the dorms. One college guaranteed my son an ocean view from his dorm. I'm paying for that. And that is a problem. And more households just got, and so as you look at what's happening now, I think that those small liberal arts colleges, which we're already struggling, but we're trying to compete on those very metrics. We're trying to say, okay, we're small. Your biggest class size is going to be 15. Well, now they're going to have to go to 20 to survive. And if they can't get the 20 students to fill the class, then they're going to fail. And so this is a trend that's been going for a while just because I think of this rising competition for students in space. But I think it's now gotten to the point where where it's getting real for the institutions. And if you look at closures in the United States of these private small colleges, you see a lot of that happening. We actually had several universities offer their campuses to us as we were building the University of Austin. We just weren't quite sure how our campus could be in Ohio or Alabama or New York if we were the University of Austin.
Just on the topic of diversity, with respect to Austin, I think that what a lot of students profit from in a university with the tenure model is diversity of age and experience of instructors. I mean, it's really nice to have the experience of learning from a professor emeritus or someone very senior in their career. Does an untenured model necessarily mean a young faculty? Have the people at Austin thought about that and how that's going to look long term?
They have, and there's two answers to that. One is, we did get some more senior faculty, and we hired some full professors. We pay the full professors more. They just don't get tenure. And we also are bringing in senior faculty. So there's going to be a senior visiting rotation coming in where they'll come for a semester or a quarter. I guess we're in quarters, so a quarter or a year. And so the idea is to seed the faculty for two reasons. One is mentorship of the younger faculty, but two is for the students to access more experience and wisdom and their networks, which is really important to the model. I think I have time for one more question if there's another. Or do I? Okay.
So thanks for the insight regarding the U of A. There's been a rift in the so-called anti-woke movement. And how do you foresee the University of Texas at Austin sort of moving beyond that anti-woke label? I know you said it works now for funding and popularity, but at some point, I assume that it might become a liability. So how does the university move beyond being an anti-woke university and towards just being a university and serving the purpose of a university?
Well, and this is why I bristled every time somebody said we're anti-woke. It was never our intent to be anti-woke. We are, like I said, a-woke. We don't have a position as an institution on that particular set of issues. Now, we would do a disservice to our students if we didn't have conversations with people who legitimately thought about the world that way, right? Because if we want to build bridges, I mean, the biggest innovation at the University of Austin is getting our students to talk to students who think differently than them and faculty who think differently than them. So our students are all over the political and ideological spectrum. The faculty are all over the political and ideological spectrum. I mean, I don't know anybody who's written a book in defense of wokeism or anything like that, but there are people who are sympathetic to that perspective. And so the idea is to teach students how to have civil conversations with people that they disagree with. And this used to be normal in the State House. We were talking about politics a little bit at lunch. this used to be normal in the State House, but it's a skill that's been completely lost. I mean, now, especially with social media and online programs and everything else, we're lucky to have students who can talk to other humans, period. But to have a deep conversation about ideology is one of the skills that they have to learn in class. I know when I was at Pepperdine, we were working on viewpoint diversity. I actually had a student who had 7-digit following on the internet as a conservative. And I made that student take the position of open border specialists in a video debate, which created all kinds of problems for her, but we solved them. But the point was, she needs to be able to explain the other side and do it in a respectful way. I mean, I don't know if you ever took a conflict resolution class, but one of the skills they teach you is, let me try and summarize what I think you're telling me. People don't do that anymore. They don't try and understand the other side and show respect that you've taken the time to figure out how people think. And that's the skill that we need to have reinserted into the academy, in our classrooms, in our faculty offices. I mean, the question earlier, I noticed everybody kind of didn't answer in some ways, was, do these conversations happen in the faculty, in the faculty lounge? And my guess is only very quietly. And they need to be much broader on campus. So thank you all for this amazing opportunity.